Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Synchron LinkedIn Live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. This will be our last LinkedIn Live of the year, but don't worry, we will be back with a bang in 2024. And as we're closing out the year, it's always a good time to do some reflection. So that's what this discussion will be on today, is looking at the trends for aftermarket for 2023, and then also looking at like some predictions for 2024. Today's LinkedIn Live is very special because we have our CEO with us speaking for the first time. Woo! And of course, we have Sarang Zambari and Justin Konopask, who are the usual suspects. And before we jump into brief introductions, I just want to remind everyone out there today, we really encourage you to engage with us. So please add your questions or your thoughts into the comment section, and we will do our best to reply in real time. With that, I will pass it on to Fritz.
Hey, Justine, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome from my side, wherever you are in the world, either a good morning or a good night. Thanks for spending your time with us, and I'm delighted to be with my fellow colleagues, Justin, Sarang.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. I'm Justin Konopask. As Justine mentioned, one of the usual suspects on our LinkedIn Lives, Director of Industry Solutions here, and really happy to have the opportunity to have a chat with Fritz and Sarang and just kind of look at 2023 in a rearview mirror, some of the things we anticipated coming into the year, what we learned throughout, and then what we can expect in 2024. So excited for this conversation.
Yeah, hey, thanks, guys. It's Sarang Zambari here, everyone. I'm the Senior Director of Industry Solutions and Business Development at Synchron. And like Justin said, I'm extremely excited for the LinkedIn Live. I was just talking to these guys earlier. I feel like we haven't been live in a little while. So really nice to get back on LinkedIn and, have a great discussion as we wrap up the year. And wow, what a year it's been. I mean, look, from everything from a recession that, I don't know, did it happen? Did it not happen? Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that to, there's obviously geopolitical conflicts going on in the world, supply chain challenges. And of course, let's not forget everything that's going on with new technology and things like artificial intelligence. I mean, it has been one hell of a year. And I think we've learned a lot. And I was thinking back on the year, guys, and I've gone through a lot of different conferences and different events this year. And I'll tell you, one event that really was interesting for me was an event that we did in Zurich, Switzerland. And the event was very focused on bringing new technology into your organization and exploring different solutions like artificial intelligence or other solutions that can support your organization. And I remember I was in a group of different aftermarket and service leaders, and we were talking about the challenges of bringing new technology into your business. And a lot of people were bringing up points like, well, you have to think about data security and cleaning up data, and you have to think about, what's your integration strategy. And it was interesting. There was a service leader that jumped in and he said, everyone stop. And he said, look, these sorts of concerns, data challenges, data securities, integration concerns, he's like, yeah, these are always concerns. And, but there's ways of getting over these sorts of challenges in your organization. He said, the biggest concern for me is actually, are we moving fast enough as a business? He said he's never seen a time when technology has advanced so rapidly. And his view was that technology was going to be the great equalizer. And he was very concerned, where are some of the smaller competitors going to make investments in different types of technology, try things out with their business, and be able to create a competitive differentiator and gain some market share. So he was very focused on making sure that his big organization was flexible enough to try out some new technology. And Justin, Fritz, I wanted to see if you're seeing, or hearing similar sorts of discussions, or even, how you're looking at things like artificial intelligence and how organizations are trying to bring these new technology solutions into their business?
Absolutely, I'll be happy to pick it here. And Sarang, normally the first question given to me is not about economy, but more about if I had that glasses before I joined Synchron, and if I told them from this concert Oktoberfest. And the answer is no, they're not from Oktoberfest, and I had them before Synchron. But lucky me, I chose orange as the color, so I didn't need to change glasses.
It's the right choice.
But back to the question: are we moving fast enough? I believe the observation the gentleman in Zurich made is actually spot on, because you can find 1,000 reasons to not act, and none of those reasons are new. I want to even believe that the biggest reason which I'm hearing from customers is when it comes to digitization, that, hey, the whole digitization effort of any company is all about ERP upgrade, SAP HANA, all resources are bound for years and can't do anything before that happens. And, reality is also that's not really true, because there are ways to address these type of things. There are ways to make digitization jumps without getting locked down by these type of constraints. After all, I believe it's being tied together with how important customers do view some of these, let's say, technology evolutions, and can they touch what their benefit from this is. You take the whole topic of artificial intelligence. I would want to say that, to me, 2023 has been the year of AI. The whole ChatGPT, let me call it truly revolution, kind of was an eye-opening for all of us when it came to understanding how that could change our lives, not just business, but really our lives. I mean, kids in school are doing their homework now with this and all these kind of things. You can really transfer a whole lot of opportunities now to that part of artificial intelligence support. And it's not only, this is now the trick around the whole thing, it's not only creating opportunities, it's also creating some new fears. I talked to a customer earlier this week. It's actually interesting. It was just this week. And he said, Fritz, I have no interest for any field technician repair reports being written by ChatGPT, because I don't want artificial intelligence in some years being able to rebuild my products. My products are my IP. And if I hand this over, this kind of knowledge about sort of the IP to ChatGPT, I'm going to lose my edge. So there is a choice to be made for companies around how far they want to go. And I feel this is still what's keeping companies a bit more busy. It's not so much the understanding about, is this a game changer? It is a game changer. There's no discussion about this. It's more still the question about how small do we dare to start? How far can we dare to jump? And that trade-off, I think, is still a little bit in exploration by many companies. But hey, the train has left the station. That I will also say, there is no company not looking at this.
I agree.
At that.
I 100% agree. I mean, Justin, what about you? I mean, look, I know you and I use things like ChatGPT quite often, even when we're trying to do some research. But what's your read?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, Sarang, when you mentioned the question, are we moving fast enough? And I think when you look at some of these larger corporations, and my background having worked at one for quite a period of time, it is a challenge to move fast there. And I think you have several layers of challenges, if you will. The first one being people don't like change, especially when they've been going through the same cycle over and over again. I always say that people won't change until the pain of not changing exceeds the pain of changing. And I think companies are finding a way to be more proactive as opposed to being reactive in that situation. But this other part of it is, and you've heard me talk about this before, is the data side of it. The bigger the company is, the more data that they have, which in theory, especially when you're talking about AI, is actually very powerful, provided it's structured and can be used. But if it's not structured, if it's just kind of a mess, when you think of these different AI capabilities like natural language processing, you need context associated with the text that's actually in the data itself. And without that context from a subject matter expert, to Fritz's point, that's kind of that IP there. So how much can you accelerate going forward if you're also trying to do it with the data that's not really, in line with the context for the outcome you're trying to achieve?
Justin, is it fair to say, like, look, if you haven't added the context to your data, if you haven't structured your data in the right way, that implementing certain things could actually bring more challenges to your business?
Absolutely. And I think especially in service, where time and time again, we see industries that are driven through quality and regulatory requirements. Like, these GPT models, they are very confident, almost misleadingly confident, if that makes sense. Like, it can be deceiving to the individual on the other side, especially as we're seeing a turnover in workforce. You want to make sure that the access to data that they're getting is 100% in line with the quality and regulatory controls that you have.
Well, if that's the case, then do you think as more and more organizations are looking at bringing different technology into the business, it seems like the expertise that those technology vendors are bringing to the market is going to be extremely critical, because that's going to help you accelerate time to value. And you want to make sure that the technology vendor understands what's going on in your business, understands, the space that you're operating in. I feel like this is critical. Otherwise, you could run into some of those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I think we're at Synchron, we have a lot of folks that came from industry, so we can speak the language. We understand the challenges in depth that, these technicians, these service leaders are facing day in and day out. And it's critical when you're thinking about that data journey and ultimately achieving the outcomes with this new technology. That's where the value is coming from some of these technology partners. And I'm going to emphasize the word partners there, because I think that's a really key transition that we're seeing with respect to, buying cycles for technology. Is you're no longer involved in a transaction of like, I'm going to purchase a license for this and I'm going to then just start using it. When you're dealing with these large scale changes, you want a partnership, because ultimately it's way beyond that transaction. It's a journey that you're going to be on together, and there's going to be continuous steps forward on both parties.
Justin, let me maybe add to this. Number one, we have the privilege to be allowed to work with many manufacturing and distribution companies, which you could credibly call leaders in their categories. And the hard reality is that while their business models look similar at the highest level, they're very specific underneath. And it is, if I go simply, even let me take construction industry. So it's an industry where we really have a lot of great customers. I mean, JCB and Caterpillar and Hitachi and Volvo, like wonderful companies. If I look underneath, while at the highest level, they all have distributors and dealerships for kind of as distribution model. But then if you really look into the question how they work with their distributors, totally different. Can't really compare that. So to that extent, technology in first place needs to be adaptive enough to cater different business models, and you need a technology partner which understands that it is specific, and you can't simply go with your cookie cutter recipe to any of these companies and say, let's do it like this because that's how the product should work. So that's point number one. The second point I'd like to maybe also stress with this, and this is also quite critical because you have to think about sort of the way how to get there with adoption. I'm personally absolutely convinced that almost all manufacturing companies realize that when they look at the service business, they need to think about the fourth platform next to the three platforms they're already using. All companies use an ERP for their material management and their resource management. All companies use a CRM as a platform for their customer engagement. All companies use a PLM platform as a platform for the whole product design. And I'm personally convinced that all companies also will need a service lifecycle management platform in a single integrated unified platform where you can bring all of these data and processes together, which doesn't mean that you need to buy the full thing in one shot. That's not what I'm saying, but you need to be able to go on a path to get there. Now, all companies have something already for anything. So you will not find a single large company on this planet which says, "Oh, I'm going to implement an ERP for services." That's not a viable concept. But I believe that they all realize that as their business models evolve towards service excellence rather than simple service profitability, that this is a pivotal element. And let's just think about what that means. I mean, I heard more and more in the last year. I heard from a commercial vehicle manufacturer in the US that they're going to move much more into the question about what type of recurring services can they build around their commercial vehicles. I heard the same thing in India, like a commercial vehicle manufacturer being exposed to the question about, hey, municipalities not wanting to buy buses anymore, but paying by transported mile. A much different business model. I mean, I heard a very traditional automotive car company thinking highly innovative, and I dare to say it's Ford. Hopefully they will not kill me for this, but they have changed their way to look at things, from looking at, for instance, parts availability for spare parts, to the question about how can we make sure that we maximize same-day repair opportunity in their dealerships. So really a very customer-centric viewpoint there they have adopted on. And that's, so if you want to do that, you need to have, if you talk about technology and data, you need to bring it together that these things can work together seamlessly. Because if you would patch it together from individual different landscapes of little islands, you may get to a certain level of execution. You never can get great. And I personally believe if you really want to have that path to greatness in services, you need to think about the whole thing as a technology which is designed from the moment of service execution backwards into the technology, rather than bringing it from a parts world, from a technician world, from a knowledge world, from a price world. That's not going to work, because you can't bring these things together. So it
almost seems like, Fritz, like people, organizations have transitioned maybe over the past 10, 15 years, right? From first they were looking at point solutions, then, we had challenges around integration, so they transitioned to platforms. I think now a lot of organizations are looking for modularity within their platforms, right? A platform that can support their service business, but, you can take steps to be able to get to your ultimate vision.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about. I believe that ultimately the platform will always prevail, like you did in ERP. A platform, even if it doesn't bring the individually best of all components or modules or whatever you want to call it together, the value of integration is humongous. And now the thing is that if you look into let's take current times. There is still spend discipline in the whole macroeconomic environment. We talked about this is not the same rosy economic climate as we looked at this 5 years ago. The world has seen COVID. The world has seen a war in the Ukraine. It has seen an energy crisis. It has seen a Middle East crisis recently. It's full of crisis. Now, that actually causes spend discipline, and also the question about how can I get there? Will I really spend millions of dollars in one shot? No, that's not what companies will do. So, but they will look into the capabilities. And frankly, that's what we hear. That's actually why, quite selfishly, that's why we are building towards such a integrated suite of services applications, because that's the resonance which you get back from the market, that this is what ultimately is appreciated, rather than a whole bunch of individual solutions.
Yeah, no, I agree. Guys, let's transition a little bit. Fritz, you started talking a little bit about what we're seeing happening in the market. And, when we opened up the LinkedIn Live, I made a comment around, the recession that happened or did not happen, and how that's impacting businesses. And, Justin, I know you do quite a bit of research on the markets and, the financial performance of companies. What happened? I remember we started this year and everyone was very worried about a recession. What actually happened?
Yeah. Maybe I can kind of set the stage here, and then we'll weigh in from a better, more granular company perspective and technology perspective. But, my takeaways from the research I was doing, when you look at just the amount of times recession was acknowledged at the end of 2022, coming into 2023, that was by far the biggest concerns on leadership minds. And then as we entered the year, you heard phrases like the year of efficiency. And that's, as Fritz mentioned, kind of that cost cutting, you're tightening your belt on what you're spending on. And I think a lot of this it comes as the companies and leadership are pivoting from a period where zero interest rate policy was prevalent for, more or less a decade. That period, more or less, I think is in the rearview mirror. And I think that's the key going forward that leaders have recognized as they're trying to forecast their business going forward and plan for this. With that comes more cost-conscious decisions. And I think, to Fritz's point, he brought up something that was key. When you're looking at service and all the key components from a technology perspective, piecemealing everything together one by one and integrating it is going to be a very expensive and long, drawn-out task over time. And so I think that's at least an interesting point of view for Synchron as we're looking at kind of a more of that service platform, if you will. That's kind of where my head goes as I'm looking at this, is how can you do this inexpensively going forward? Because the CFO is always going to be one of the key deciding, players when it comes to some of these buying cycles. But, I think going back to the macro situation, this fear of inflation was going to be sticky. The slowdown in the economy was going to be prevalent. At least in the U.S., the Federal Reserve yesterday basically kind of just did their victory lap, more or less, I'll say. But we're seeing quite the contrary. I think disinflation is actually occurring quite aggressively, to the point of deflation is now more a concern across the globe when you start looking at some of this performance, if you will, on the pricing side. And with that, I think we're going to probably start seeing a little bit of a pivot, as the Fed identified yesterday, where now we're supporting economic growth going forward. And so that's really where 2024 kind of gets exciting, of like, how does that look for each region? Fritz being over in Europe, us being in the US, like, we're going to have different policies, although everything's connected a great deal. Sure. Everything is going to start kind of ramping up, and then you're going to see a shift in leaders' minds.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, so what do you think this means even for industries like the construction industry, as an example, right? In the US, we have this huge infrastructure bill. It seems like, that's going to fund tons and tons of new projects. And if there's new projects, that means more equipment has to be sold, more equipment has to be maintained. And Justin, to your point, if we're trying to support economic growth, maybe companies are starting to transition a little bit, and they're saying, look, we do want to invest in new technology the right way, right? With the right vendors, with the right solutions for their business. But I mean, what's your read on what's happening with construction and where you see some of the money going?
Well, I mean, the U.S. infrastructure bill that was passed over a year ago, I think there's still about $900 billion left to be spent on those projects. And so, I think when I look at that and knowing, some players in the space, personally in the construction space, if the assets are down, they're losing money, and that's critical. And so I think service is paramount in order to basically keep the economy moving and keep their businesses growing. And so I think that's going to be key going forward for service organizations. They have a lot of weight on their shoulders. I think there's a lot of responsibility. Fritz.
Well, I mean, just to chime in here, I mean, the way how I look at this is that governments typically have, rightly so, not the best reputation for acting right in time. So it's always, there is a quite significant delay between a real problem, a government reaction, and then the government execution to things. So in a way, look, I mean, and by the way, also with governmental sort of funding, you never know if the billion really is a net billion on top of what they already account for. So that's not so clear. I'm not specifically talking about the U.S. infrastructure bill. I believe I talk, from my personal opinion, a bit more representative almost every government I could think of. Now, with that said, I think the reality is it's a quite differentiated picture. It's not easy to say recession is over, because for some companies, I would say they are really materially under pressure. So we are working with customers who say, Fritz, we have been seeing a better world. And we are also working with companies which actually are doing just fantastic. And I would say, not specifically because they're in a very unique place in their business, but the way how they execute their business is maybe just executed a bit better. Now, let me sort of even give this from a macroeconomic perspective. Let's take construction industry. You mentioned this, if you look over to Europe, there is clearly with the current interest rate, there is a crisis in the whole larger projects, construction buildings. And there are many construction site operators which are looking at with concern into the future. And at the same time, you look at a housing market which is so short of apartments for the people for the many people to live in, that governments fail to build those hundreds of thousands of apartments which they have promised to their electors. So to that extent, I think the sort of these governmental programs, they're always a little bit delayed versus what they're doing. Yeah. And I will say that catches something. It doesn't heal it entirely. I still want to believe that there are some companies which, even in the current environment, even if they don't benefit from these infrastructure programs, some of them can do somewhat better. And why do they do that? Because they have been able to position themselves in a more sustainable way to their sort of customer ecosystem. Either they have a better brand power, or they have a better product quality, or a better service execution. Typically, they have all of that a little bit together. And if you're already somewhat healthy from a financial perspective, it's easier to also sort of become a bit more accentuated where you put your investments. If you are working on a thin margin, and some industries work on a thin margin, I mean, take construction site operators, there's not a lot of margin in that business. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then you're that pressure which you then face, it becomes existential for you. So that's why I think, it's, for me, it's not so easy to say there is a crisis or there isn't. I would say for many companies there is a crisis, but there is also a way to sort of to actually succeed in the current environment. And to me, a lot, because I think this was the great thing we learned. If there was any good thing from a commercial perspective, I think many customers, and also we learned in COVID, was when we were facing that situation, when almost the full world came to a halt, it became evident that the deployed fleet of assets, not the new products and equipment, but the deployed fleet of assets need to continue to function. Yeah, I mean, all the parcels needed to be delivered. It was like, that means like, no, maybe not new commercial vehicles were sold, and I keep coming back to commercial vehicles, but I think the example is more representative to many things. But those trucks needed to drive, and all of a sudden the services topic came back to an all-time high to sort of really get all of those assets up and working.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and to that point, Fritz, my experience during that time was more focused on aircraft. Yeah. The number of aircraft were parked, and to the service aspect, aircraft don't like to sit on the ground. They like to fly. And so that created a whole different aspects with respect to service complexities that needed to be addressed. So that was definitely an interesting time.
Yeah, service doesn't stop. I mean, it's interesting. So look, let's transition a little bit. And remember, even last year, I was going to a number of different service events, and it was interesting. I remember, Justin, I talked to you about this quite a bit. I was seeing more and more presentations from service leaders on how they're looking to prioritize sustainability initiatives within their organization. And even as we look at the market and we look at a transition to EV, the EV space, I see sustainability is going to be a trend and an initiative that is going to be front and center for many organizations. But now when I'm talking to more aftermarket leaders, I think they're trying to balance, how do we prioritize sustainability and maybe additional costs that this could bring to our business? I'll give you an example. Imagine if you're in a business today where you're not necessarily leveraging the principles of a circular economy. So, when your technicians go out and they replace components on a machine, maybe you're scrapping those components. And if you wanted to create a process where you could return those components and then put them through a repair process and then put them back into good inventory, I think that could be great for the planet. It could be great to reduce waste. But guess what? If you don't have that set up today, it could be significant cost to your business to actually set up that sort of operation. So I wanted to see, if both of you are hearing things about companies prioritizing sustainability initiatives and how they're managing to balance the cost.
It's a very interesting point, and I'll go first. And Justin, you'll back me up on this one here. I honestly see again a little bit the cloud from both sides, if I may call it like this. Actually, it's the right song title at the right time of the year from Love Actually, both sides. Now, see, I mean, I think it's undisputable that the world comes to a much higher realization than ever before that we're all living on this one planet given to us, and that we have an obligation for the generation to come to protect it. And at the same time, I don't see yet that firm action everywhere to move into this radically. I will be very honest with you. I mean, the electrification of the powertrain, in particular in the automotive industry, is one example which, frankly, I will argue is heavily pushed by two things. There's a disruptive company out there, which is Tesla, which has shaken up the whole industry. And there is a lot of governmental money pumped into the whole electrification from a taxpayer's perspective to provide incentives to go there. And I will say, I find that type of taxpayers direct money direction actually meaningful and good, because I think it will help to make the planet better. All of these technologies, Sarang, which you alluded to, it's like with everything, they become profitable at scale. So to get them going, that's the tough part. So to me, the question is, how can governments help ultimately the end consumer to make this digestible? So you need to create that incentives at the right point in time. I want to believe that I have not met that single company which says, I don't want to become more sustainable. I mean, they all want. The question is, of course. And here I will stand in front of everybody to say, look, this capitalistic world is not so bad. I think they realize this. What they also have is an obligation for their employees, for their shareholders, which they also need to care. So the question is, how can you find the right balance? And I don't think that is outside of the electric vehicle sort of governmental money push, that it is that clear to everybody. Now, this is, again, where I believe the service business in the next 5 years will undergo a major next transition wave, because there is already now a very clear view on the profitability contribution of service business to the overall company. And as I believe, frankly, all of these companies realize that the service business becomes much more of a mainstream business for them than it ever had been, even for a manufacturing company, where their service revenue shares are already between 20 and 50%, depending on you count and depending on where you look into which industry vertical. They will then collectively sort of look into the question also about if they can do this thing greener. I'm very convinced about this, because, again, no company is against this. So I do agree with you, Sarang, that this is something where companies need help to make that happen. And by the way, they also need help from technology to actually surface where the potential is. See, I mean, we actually have this in our product roadmap to help parts planning, parts availability being optimized also based on how you ship the parts. If you call the parts 10 times in 10 days, or if you call the parts one time in 10 days and have one consigned shipment there, which just comes at a much better ecological footprint. So these type of optimization opportunities we all have. And this is, again, also the contribution which technology can make to help those manufacturing companies to make it better.
Yep. Fritz, I'll read you a line here. So, right now we are working with one of the largest HVAC equipment manufacturers in the world. And, I was looking at the company, and they have a number of different sustainability initiatives going on. And I was looking at one of their reports, and there's this quote here from their founder. And the quote says, "There is no value in the economic success of any industrial initiative unless it is accompanied by a commitment to social progress." And so it's interesting to hear things like that. And I agree with you. Companies are absolutely prioritizing these sorts of initiatives. I don't think that's going away at all. But I think companies are trying to figure out what's the right way to do this, what's the smart way to do this to make sure that we're running a profitable business.
And I will personally say, Sarang, that I believe in the power of creativity, invention, and autonomy here. I believe that the most effective way to do it is let the market find the solution itself rather than regulating it. I believe that governments can play a role to put some important accents to get certain things going. But I feel that there is hope for us here.
I agree. Hey, let's double down on this profitability. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, let me jump in here for a second. John Carroll from Service Council just brought up a comment as well on priority for sustainability and return rate of parts. Justina, I hope you can bring that comment up here. Next one down, sorry. The last one, the third one. Yep. Nope. Sorry.
There you go.
Okay. So this was interesting. And those of you who don't know John, he's fantastic over at the Service Council. So much great information there that he and the team compile and share with service leaders around the world. So highly recommend following him. John, thanks for the engagement here in this tidbit. I think this is interesting where some of the recent surveys that have been taking across the industry, service supply chain, on-time delivery, parts revenue, they're number 1 and 2 priorities. But you noted here, number 8 was service return rate of parts, and number 10 was actually sustainability. It's interesting to me to see that. And I think maybe Sarang, as we've attended a lot of these events, that almost kind of flows with some of the keynotes that we've heard and the emphasis in some of these breakout sessions and the conversations we have with service leaders where, you go back a couple of years, that was extremely relevant and always talked about. And now it's definitely switched to some of these other topics, as John had mentioned. And so, I'm going to circle back.
I mean, if I may, I think it's really also, I as I said, I don't think it's bad intent. I think it is a little bit more of a question about, do companies understand what they're fighting for? So when I look at this from a service perspective, I am convinced that if you think about the service business, that you can at some point in time soon scrap the word after from aftermarket. So because it's going to be a matter of be or not to be. And as companies more and more understand that, the first problem they need to solve is how can I stay alive? How can I continue to be a market leader in 10 years rather than being wiped out by some other one who's doing this simply better than I do? I mean, it is all a fight about that same dollar of customer and consumer spend. And therefore, the loyalty to your existing customer is becoming increasingly important. I mean, I come back now to whatever. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at hospital equipment or cars or even construction equipment. I mean, why would certain companies be able to command a brand premium? Because they're doing certain things better than others. And if you start to really alienate your existing install base, you're cutting the lifeline of everything what you have. And that is why I believe it is the question of be or not to be for them to sort of think about the whole service business in the future. And as companies realize the potential and the need to catch up here, I can understand that you not always think about, I really will say this, even if it is unpopular. I don't like it. I also will say this because I have children myself. I want them to grow up and I want them to also give birth to other children. I want to be a grandpa one day. And I would love to see this world really kind of being able to survive for the long. And at the same time, I understand that these companies, which also have a social responsibility for employees and many other things, that they simply ask the question about how can I stay alive tomorrow? So the question is, how can this be combined? And again, I think it's not only their responsibility. Their governments and their technology innovators like we are. We got to give them some weapons to do this greener, better. That's how I look at this.
Fritz, we might have to take that quote, how can I stay alive tomorrow, and put it on our website. But I think you're absolutely right? That's going to be front and center for every single company. I remember, we did that research study earlier this year where we interviewed 500 executives, right? We interviewed heads of service, supply chain leaders, CFOs, CIOs. We asked them a lot of different questions around, how they're handling supply chain issues, how they're bringing new service offerings to the market. And I remember one of the key insights that we found from that research study was that most of these executives believed that if they could make the right investments in their organization, that could be operational changes, it could be technology investments, they felt like on average, they had the ability to drive 10.5 additional percent in profitability to their business. I remember when I saw that, I said, I don't know if I'm looking at a sales presentation here or what, because it was very interesting to hear that directly from service leaders. And I'm even thinking back on a conversation that I had with the VP of service growth for one of the biggest medical technology manufacturers. I talked to him a couple of months ago, and he was very focused on this as well. He said, look, I have an initiative to drive more profitability in my business. And guess where the first place he looked? He said, look, I'm going to take a look at my service contracts. And I asked him, I said, that's interesting. Why service contracts? I said, service contracts seem to be pretty standard from my perspective, right? You have a bronze level, a silver level, and a gold level contract. And I asked him, if you sold two different customers the gold level contract, why would the profitability be so different? And I remember he shook his head and he looked at me and he said, Sarang, look, while we position the gold level contract, that's not what we actually sell our end customer. We sell them the gold level contract with 5 or 6 or 7 different customizations added on top of that. So he said, at the end of the day, we have 200 variations. Yes, 200 variations of a service contract. And he said it's very difficult to then predict costs over a 3 to 5 year period and understand our profitability.
Sarang, could not agree more. Look, we're working currently with a company where I believe we could jointly show that about 80% of their current services contracts, maintenance and inspection contracts, are actually not profitable.
Yep.
Now that's the downside. Now look at the upside. It's a bit more speculation, I will admit this, but I think there are discussions about Apple Care as an extended warranty, which in a way is nothing else but a service contract. It's an entitlement, yeah. That's creating $8 billion a year for Apple, growing at 20% a year, kind of doubling towards 2025, becoming 16 billion, and being speculated for having far above average gross margins for Apple than anything else. So if you're being speculated, numbers are not public, but I think one could suspect that this is to a certain extent true. So my point is, if you get it right, this is huge. Yeah. If you do it wrong, you're losing your shirt.
Couldn't agree more. Justin, I know you've worked on both sides of the fence, right? Managing service contracts and trying to figure out how to bring new service offerings to the market. And now you're on the technology side, helping organizations, sort through some challenges and quite a bit of complication in this space as well. What's your read?
I'm going to go back to something Fritz said earlier, and that was, when we're looking at technology needs for each industrial player that we work with, each of these leaders has their own different requirements. And so I think the technology provider has kind of that mandate, or that, it's our responsibility to make it configurable and modular enough to be able to, handle all these different specific use cases, but at the same time, always have a core base of how we're trying to tackle these problems. And to me, what you just described, Sarang, that resonates really well with the 200 different variations, where each service contract is inevitably going to have slightly different variations. And I love the example that Fritz mentioned with Apple Care, because it highlights something different about a lot of the industry leaders that we work with. So when you think about Apple products, your phone, your AirPods, your iPad, everything is relatively repetitive. And I'm using the word simple is obviously an understatement, but you get the idea. Well, there's only so many ways that will break. And then when it does break, there's only so many ways to repair it. But if you start looking at construction equipment or electric vehicles, the ways that it can break increase, orders of magnitude. And so I think that variation needs to be taken into account. And so, that's where I think the interesting challenge, it's a very interesting challenge, because to Fritz's point, if you get it right, it can be one of the most profitable lines of business you've ever seen. But the risk of getting it wrong is also equally costworthy to your business as well. And so I think that's where this balance comes in, where you need to be able to set the boundaries, but you also need to have certain flexibility. Ultimately, this needs to be balanced from a cost profitability perspective, cost to serve perspective.
Yeah, that's why I think more and more, like we see this, we see lots of transitions happening in service, first of all, right? Everything from moving from a cost center to a profit center, from moving from reactive to proactive to predictive service. And now I see the transition of moving from selling products to, selling services to selling outcomes. But, I think, to go through that transition, you're fundamentally sometimes changing your business model, and you need to make sure that your organization is prepared for it and you have the right guidance to be able to do that. Otherwise, like you said, Justin, you can introduce many more challenges and profitability risk to your business. So I know we've got maybe about 15 minutes left here. I want to give our audience a little bit of a 2024 outlook. And I'm curious, what challenges are you already anticipating as we start to look into 2024? And I know Synchron has a number of different initiatives going on to help and support our customers, but what are you already anticipating as challenges?
So from a individual company's perspective, I will probably argue that most companies have laid out their plans by now. Because look, we're mid-December. I mean, budget season for most companies kind of is almost over, and I believe that it's typically sort of the last 4 or 5 months in a year where companies start to prepare their plans and investments for the next year. So I would hope that already by now, many of our great customers and also of our prospects we're talking to have thought about what they want to do next year. So to that extent, I don't think now anything new, disruptive would still happen. And hey, as it is a sad statement, but I think in a sad way, I have to concede that the world had to learn to deal with all the crises going on, and maybe that's even a good thing with human mankind, that we're not always being fully eaten up by this, but kind of also are able to work through these type of things. So I'm generally an optimistic person to that extent. I hope that despite all these crises, which are so painful and sad to watch, that there is a better future ahead of us. See, I want to almost bring it back to that statement of that, I believe, Zurich conference, which there is I'd say many companies are busy with many digitalization initiatives. And I'm firmly convinced that the topic of digitizing your service business process, about how you plan your services, how you price your services, and how you execute your services, how you deliver your services, that continues to be of a pivotal area of companies to invest in. So back to the statement of are we acting fast enough? While I will say not all companies will massively accelerate everything, I believe a few will do. And I'm going to look forward to see if they can actually sort of create a significant advantage above their peers in the years to come from some of that fast-moving stuff. I personally think that in particular, the topic of what we just touched upon last, the question about how you monetize around service contracts, that's going to move massively into the center of attention. Because what we already are somewhat used to is a bit more from the, let me call it, break-fix service model. The other sort of like, how do you plan spare part availability in your own parts distribution center network, in your distributor network? That's kind of like a known quantity to a certain extent. The question on how you price those spare parts. I mean, even depot repair or field service management, that's not so much a new thing. There's still a huge adoption deficit, but it's not sort of the newest topic in town. the AI-powered ability to better understand your service contracts, I believe that's going to move massively into the center of attention. And I believe it's going to come into two stages. The first is simple transparency. The first question, Bill, for the most companies is going to be like, when we look at these service contracts, are we making money or not? And I will honestly say to whoever I've been talked to in the last couple of months about this thing, they have been admitting that they fly relatively blind, which is almost shocking for some formidable companies we're talking to. So that transparency, I believe, is sort of the entry point for many of the companies to look into this. Then obviously there is the question about how you improve that. Again, the whole question of what a part costs and how you price a part, also in a bundle of a service contract, it's a known element, but the question about how you make this whole thing work over the life cycle of a product, which is not as, I don't want to call an iPhone simple, for sure not. It's more powerful than all computers together, which have been flying to the moon in '69. So, but you were right. I mean, if I look simply at the complexity of what needs to operate together, also from let's say an earth mover or a crane or an aircraft turbine, that's massive. And I think this whole question of how can we get better hold of the profitability of service contracts and how can we add new contracts which are profitable from the outset, that's going to become a mainstream topic for many companies. That's at least my...
Yeah. Fritz, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but do you see a world where, if an organization, let's say, is going to sell a new service contract to a customer, in real time, they will be able to understand, as we're adding on these different components, as we're making some of these customizations, that they'll be able to estimate costs over a 3 to 5 year period and have a much better view on the profitability of that contract as they're configuring it for a customer?
I would say absolutely yes. I mean, look, optimization always has a starting point. So if the starting point is simply the transparency you gain from your history the first time, okay, it is what it is. But then you will use the ability to reprice your contracts and have, in the same way as you've been pricing your parts more smartly in the past. That's gonna evolve there too. I mean, we are now beyond a world where parts pricing is being done based on a cost plus basis. I mean, many companies look into, in particular, the great ones, the sophisticated ones, they look into parts pricing based on true parts value. The whole question of value-based pricing sits at the center. But nonetheless, this to me, it's kind of like a discipline established, if you know what I mean. While not everybody may be there, but it's kind of like a known quantity. The question of how you bring this into something way bigger, the service contract, which has penalties. I mean, again, come back to the 200 variations of your gold contract, because you have a little bit of a balcony here and a little bit of a service level for that customer there. Yep. How can you make sure that you really understand this thing? And you can, I'm convinced you can only do that with technology. It's undoable by human beings with Excel, because we will all die in data which we will not understand anymore. So the technology needs to help and will make a difference. I also believe the task of the technology will be to surface why these changes are happening, because it's like for people using these systems, I mean, there is a fear of this black box type of thing where you feel like, okay, I just push a button and now my result is entirely different. Why would it look differently? So that also is a responsibility for technology vendors to create that user experience that the users take along the journey to understand why these changes are happening.
Well, what happens, and Justin, I want to get your take on this. All these organizations are operating today. Some of them have really profitable contracts. Some of them don't. Some of them it's a black box. What's the cost of doing nothing? What if they do not do anything? What happens?
Well, I think there's twofold. Just from a pure business perspective, you're going to see their competitors surpass them with respect to profitability, both top line and bottom line. I think that's a very real risk at the end of the day. But then secondly, and arguably the more important part, is I'm looking at it from their customer's lens, because ultimately it's not just about changing the price of a contract. It's about adapting the offerings and the outcomes to what your consumers are looking for. And Fritz, you brought up the buses in India, for example. pay per passenger mile is a really good example. And so having these types of offerings align with the change in the consumer demand is going to help tenfold. I mean, it improves your brand, it improves your top and bottom lines, it improves your customer experience all around. But I think focusing on that end customer, it's a way that the dog wags the tail instead of the tail wagging the dog. Maybe that's the best way that I would put it.
So my 2024 prediction: loyalty will be king. It will be the most important thing for service organizations as we go into next year. That's what's going to determine is service going to be a differentiator for your business.
Sarang, I'm convinced that this is sort of the theme for the whole next decade.
Yep.
I don't think it's just a 2024 thing.
Yep.
I believe that the whole question of customer loyalty sits at the core of how business model evolution will happen. And I also will give almost all of these great companies all their credit that it's not that they're too stupid to not think about this. I don't think, Sarang, that there is a single company doing nothing. So you were asking about the implication of doing nothing. I will say, I don't even think that there is this company out there which does nothing. So I think what they're trying to figure out is, what can I do to start with, or how can I get beyond what I already do? And it's not always that easy for companies. Think about certain manufacturers dealing with distribution channels. I mean, some of them, they go direct, some of them work with distributors, with dealers, with whatever. Then the question about who does what. I mean, if the service happens at your distributor or at your dealer, then the question is, how can you back the service contracts which they give to their customers? How can you incent them to create service contracts to the joint end customers, which you then back as an OEM? That's a very interesting question these companies also need to think through about which part of their customer base can they address directly. It's also a channel disruption thing. I've met a board member of a large construction company, a global, very well-respected brand. And I would say he's talking about his dealers as his customers. And I felt that there is a certain level of almost fear to disrupt that channel, if you know what I mean, which I understand. But then if they look at this like that, then they need to think about the question about how they can actually incent their dealers to do more of these type of things. Yeah. Because ultimately, this chain of loyalty flows from the end customers through the dealers back to the OEM. And that to me is sort of, so I fully agree with you. Service level execution, that's really what's getting into the boardrooms. And come back to Ford. I think it's probably triggered by the arrival of their current CEO about 2 years ago or so. I mean, the whole mindset about moving away from fill rate optimization more towards how can I get same day repair done at a digestible level, to me shows that companies which one may say are established players in the industry since 100 years. Ford was one of the first companies building cars in the universe. I mean, at least in this universe, which you know, so at least on this planet, I should say. So some call them a dinosaur. I call them highly innovative on this type of thought process, and I find that pretty cool.
I agree. Look, we got to close out, but I want to do this. One piece of advice from each of you for somebody that's in the role of being a service leader today. What a piece of advice would you give them? I don't care what it is. Give them a Super Bowl pick. Give them advice for their business. What's the piece of advice? Justin, why don't you go first?
I'm going to go back to listen to your customer, and I mean the end customer. I think you can't go wrong there. And as Fritz said, loyalty is going to be paramount, going forward. It's not just 1 year. This is a journey. And so listen and learn from your customers.
All right. Fritz, what about you?
To avoid duplication, because you had a really good one, Justin. So I'll pick another one a little bit closer to my heart. Think about technology not as increments. Think about that service business platform, almost like the analogy of ERP, but for the service business, where if you have an opportunity to start small with something, think about the potential to bring it together in a much grander scheme of things down the road. While this doesn't need to be now, you're creating a whole bunch of new opportunities for the future to come. So to me, is sort of the whole question about how do I look at service business much more as a platform business, also from a service execution perspective, matters a lot. And here I would invite all of our audience to sort of think about this, because it's very simple to disaggregate all the functions, say you all pick your best of breed. You will never be able to tuck it together.
Yeah.
The question about how a price campaign on certain parts drives artificial demands in your part supply chain, you'll not figure these applications are not talking. The question about sort of a warranty campaign to be executed without a seamless flow into sort of the knowledge of where the products sit out there and the equipment sit out there and where you need to restock the replacement parts real quick will drive your campaign durations forever. I could go on here. So the whole question about integrating these processes sits at the core of like driving better service excellence. And this is why you have to start small. I would never expect anything bigger, but make as a part of your selection process, consider the question about where you really want to go with this thing.
I agree 100%. Look, my piece of advice is look for the expertise, right? As you're evaluating different pieces of technology to bring into your business, I think expertise is going to be very important. Look for the organizations that are willing to invest time in your business, understand their business, or they already have an idea of what's going on in the space. I think that's extremely important. Guys, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I think this was a really interesting discussion. We got through a lot of topics, and I want to thank our audience. Thanks to John Carroll as well for making a few comments. So thank you so much. One last thing. Synchron is going to be at the Associated Equipment Distributors event, AED, in Las Vegas coming up. I think it's the middle of January 16th. So we're looking forward to seeing many of our customers there.
It's fantastic to meet you guys there.
Yeah, please come and talk to us. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarang. Thank you, Justin. And thanks to all of our audience. Happy Christmas and season's greetings.